Google form that is the lab. I also sent it to you.
Yes, she's very buxom too. Nothing, just a simple. She darn.
Yeah.
Not very good at introductions. This is James Schlitt. You're gonna have to tell them your title.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm a graduate student with the Biocomplexity Institute of Virginia Tech, and currently doing research as a computational epidemiologist. A lot of my work has been sort of like crisis management. You know, when you have a new big bad in town, what is the best way that you can characterize it? How can you find like the weak attack points where you could stage an intervention? And one thing I've been quite fascinated with for a while has been the Twitter message mapping with regards to the opioid epidemic. So, of course, we're all familiar with the opioid epidemic. It's been going on for quite a while. It's taking a really major toll, and it's probably the biggest preventable health issue facing the United States at present. Every day we see 116 people dying of opioid-related fatalities, and 66% of drug overdose deaths involve opioids. So between 1999 and 2010, opioid prescriptions quadrupled, which is really could be driving a lot of this. And in the same time as these deaths were increasing and these prescriptions were increasing, we weren't actually seeing an increase in chronic pain diagnoses. So, there's a major disconnect between how much of this is actually going out into communities versus how much appears to be needed. Further, we found that 80% of heroin users started with prescription opioids before moving on to heroin. So, right now, this is growing quite quickly, and a lot of it is due to high-potency synthetic opioids. At present, things like carfentanil are just cheaper than almost any other illicit drug on the market. So, even other cheaper, more easily accessed, like, illicit drugs are very often now just a binding agent with carfentanil or otherwise significantly spiked. So this can lead to a lot of cases with contamination. We have these really novel high-potency opioids that are coming out of labs, and when they hit the market or when they hit the street, it's difficult to tell what the effects might be. So this project started in 2017 in the summer when there was an outbreak of overdoses in Georgia that were all tied to these fake black market Percocets. These Percocets contain two opioids previously unknown to science or law, which were monstrous in their effects. Patients who took these needed multiple doses of Narcan, often intubation, assisted breathing, and really prolonged recovery. So we started tracking the opioids with ChatterGrabber, just trying to see, with these yellow pills, was it just one bad batch moving through town, or was this going to hit other locations? Would it be over quickly, or would we even see this in Virginia? And this led to a pilot study where, beyond just tracking these, we started thinking, if we have all this opioid data, what else can we figure out? How is the discourse around opioids moving? And if we can characterize this discourse, are there ways that we could put our own messages in there, or at least just see who is doing the best job of sending health positive messages within this discourse? So our theory was that if you think back to when you were a kid, there was things that your parents could have told you that you would have listened to, but if your friends told you, you'd completely ignore. Clean your room being a pretty good example. Conversely, a lot of things you're going to process very differently based on your perceptions of the individual telling them to you. So we're looking into trying to see which users would have the greatest virality, which is to say, if I have 5 Twitter followers and my message eventually gets seen by 15 people, I'll consider that virality a 3. If we're just looking at total exposures for a given message on Twitter, the obvious message is just go to BBC, NBC, CNN, Fox nationwide. But we assume there's sort of an economy that you can't just easily go to the biggest source and have them post about this. You want to see, for a given ease of reaching, who carried messages the best. So we had a couple of research questions, which were, which sources can carry which messages the best? When is the best time and day of week to share these messages? How long do they last? How far do they carry? Are there keywords that work better than others? And also we want to see, how does the tone work? Talking about that whole example of dealing with friends or parents when a rowdy teenager, there's some things that you're told in a positive tone, you might be more likely to listen to. Other things just have a necessary gravity to them. You can't really butter them up. So conveying them with proper gravity or seriousness might be far more effective. And finally, we want to see, if we look at different audiences, people in urban and non-urban areas might have very different places in which they gather their information and in which they invest their trust. So by seeing which sources were most viable for which message based on urban or non-urban message sources, we might see the best way you could reach a community about certain concerns. So we're working on this via the health belief model, and basically we're just hoping that these messages can provide calls to action, just increase people's perceived threats or otherwise give information. Everyone knows that opioids can harm your health and they can harm your legal life. But beyond that, there's also a lot of issues with contamination. People who use opioids, they want to live a healthy life just like the rest of us. So when a bad batch of drugs is coming through town, there's a lot of brand names on these things. People might say the packet with the little joker on it, overdosed 3 of my friends last week. If we can find that and know how to talk to those people, use information sources they're already leveraging, we might be able to try to save some lives. So why Twitter? Twitter is cheap. It's consistent. There's public APIs, and it's very easy to parse and collect. The cons of Twitter research, though, are your sensitivity is going to vary wildly by condition. Generally, if people aren't bragging about it or complaining about it, it's a lot harder to find on Twitter. And also, language is fluid. So a lot of people, especially when you're dealing with things with the legality attached to them, they are intentionally evasive. The slang and the vernacular will change quickly. So you have to try really hard to make sure you're using the proper terms for discussion at that point in time. So we'll go over a quick overview of what ChatterGrabber is, how it works, how we collected the tweets, how these were manually scored, and some of the additional data labels we put onto the set. So ChatterGrabber is just a Twitter search method-based tool which I've been developing in Python. And it uses a Google Docs spreadsheet, which anyone can just look at, phone in, edit the parameters, and it just constantly queries Twitter for whatever geography, keywords, and additional filters you need to apply. The idea is that ChatterGrabber generally functions as an alarm system. It's not going to tell you how many cases of the flu are going to be in your area. That's for traditional epidemiology. What ChatterGrabber can say is, before you have the delays of people going to the doctor, getting recognized, having all the necessary paperwork go through for, say, a notifiable condition, if you see a spike of people complaining about flu-like symptoms, then as a traditional epidemiologist, you know that you need to be on your toes and pay extra attention the next day. So, this is just quick how it works. It just constantly does these repeating searches. Twitter has a lot of different ways to access data. The free one that most people use is Stream, which will give you 1% of tweets. But if you're looking for 1% of tweets in a rural population, which is intentionally evading easy keyword search, you're going to find nothing. However, Twitter actually has a search function where it will give you up to 100% of what you look for, provided you repeat it often enough that it doesn't sort of fill the bucket. And that's how ChatterGrabber works. For search terms, we went to the DEA website of drug slang, which took some manual curation because it's pretty much 10 pages long for terms that could be opioids. Vice News, and a fair bit of manual curation just for words that we were seeing coming up in these tweets a lot. And we pulled in tweets if they were posted within the United States, had a lat long box which put them within the lower 48, if they contained one or more keywords, and if they were not a retweet, so they were original content. And for retweets, we track retweets separately than original tweets because we want to see how the discussion is moving away from the content creators. So, about 2 weeks ago, we just looked at every tweet we collected in our data set and used a Twitter API to pull every single retweet of it we could find. So for message definitions, we have contamination, which is people discussing drugs with dangerous potency or unknown or unlisted ingredients. Public intervention, people talking about things that should be done or need to be done to just help society out a bit. Legal consequences, this could be someone saying they got arrested. This could be someone saying someone else got arrested. But any mention of legal consequences, regardless of the relation to the poster. Avoidance, which is just a classic DARE campaign. Hey kids, don't do drugs. Avoidance doesn't necessarily carry a reason. It could just be, I don't use that stuff. You all shouldn't either. Health consequences and use witnessed, which wasn't really valuable for message mapping, but we just want to see how it will compare when people were talking about their or their friend's drug use. And as a lot of benzos have actually been found contaminated with, like carfentanil and else on the market, we looked at tweets specifically that referenced opioids or benzos. So other substances of abuse, if we found them, we consider them irrelevant in the set. For profiles, we scored them as law enforcement, agencies, organizations, or a representative thereof. So an agency could be anyone with a firm or aspirational role in the government, including DEA, candidates for local office. Organization would be schools, companies, nonprofits, anyone that maybe doesn't directly have to do something about this, but is trying to. News media, anyone who is trusted as a source of information. And this wasn't just health news. There'd be a lot of cases where music or sports news would mention a famous personality had issues with opioid abuse. And then, social pages or your musicians, comedians, an entertainment-focused page that functions like an individual, but with a larger following. So, during this period, we captured over 132,000 original tweets, which had keywords referencing opioids. Because I'm human, I sampled that down to 20,000 randomly selected ones to randomly or manually score. Of these, we found 37% of them were actually relevant. The others were just false positive from a keyword search, so we filtered those out. And of these 7,480 relevant tweets, we captured 5,078 retweet tweets. Within these, we found 6,300 unique users and a fair bit of suspected bots. There's an API called Botometer, which can just look at a profile, classify it, and give you a fairly good guess on whether or not this is an automated source. Also, we're seeing a lot of deleted profiles, which is really tricky to judge. Some of these deleted profiles were deleted because they were bots that got found and banned. Some of these were dealers or users or otherwise people posting inappropriate content who had to leave Twitter for one reason or another.
Are these also just only public profiles that you were able to
Yes.
collect data from? Okay.
Yeah, not only can I not access private data, I don't want to access private
Right,
data.
right, okay.
Yeah, especially, there's obvious sensitivities with something
Yeah.
like substances of abuse. I
Right.
I don't ever want to make the arrest all these people list.
Yeah.
So
I just wasn't sure what type of data it grabbed at ChatterGrabber.
Yeah.
So only the public profiles that you can get this from.
it only found tweets that were public at the time the ChatterGrabber captured them.
Okay.
Some of these tweets were deleted or removed afterwards.
Okay.
A lot of these profiles were deleted or removed afterwards.
Okay.
And then for the retweets, we're actually seeing a larger portion of suspected bots. And there were accounts in here which were just notably uncharacteristic. They seem to be procedurally looking for, angry things happening and amplifying them. Pretty classic. If we have a little problem over here, bots pour gasoline on it, and everyone gets upset and less gets accomplished. So for geography, we found of the original tweets we captured, 70% of them had locations that we could geocode, and 64.6% of those locations were within the lower 48.
On the slide before that.
Okay.
It looks like there's like is there one day where there's a huge spike in tweets, or is there like a backstory with that?
Demi Lovato overdosed on. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's-
Interestingly,
you know that.
we see a pretty strong spike of deleted profiles there. So I didn't check yet to see the proportion of it relative to other days,
It's all the eradicators.
but I don't include it in this presentation. In the previous pilot study for this, I actually had some figures on Engram analysis, which is co-occurring words within a post. And with the Engrams, like it really just jumps out. When a school had a red ribbon week, you just it pops up right on the map. When a couple famous musicians, unfortunately passed away from overdoses, it actually showed like Little Peep died of counterfeit Xanax, just looking directly at the Engrams. So we have a couple units of comparison, which we kind of coined here. A message is a labeled sentiment within a tweet. And a tweet could have no messages, which might be irrelevant, or it could have multiple messages. Like, for example, here's a tweet which contains every message. My friend John drove while high, overdosed, is now in jail. I wish no one would ever do drugs, and I hope the governor will institute some reform for this. Okay. Volume is the total number of tweets or messages for a given profile, regardless of who is seeing them. Exposures is volume times the amount of friends and followers for the user. And virality is to say, of all the people who retweeted a tweet, what was the ratio of total eventual views through retweets to your original audience? So if you have one follower and he has 1,000 followers and retweets you, then that's excellent virality. If you post a news story that everyone sees but no one retweets, that's poor virality. So research question number 1 was, which sources will carry which messages the best? And this was really the key thing I want to look at here. So if we look at messages by category, we see that most of the discourse is coming from individuals. It's just a lot of people talking about their daily lives, and there's just a lot of them. We see very little from law enforcement, but when we actually look at the exposures by category, we see that the individuals are a much smaller slice. And the news is, amplifies really significantly just thanks to their huge followerships and commands a much larger portion of the discourse. Also, curiously, we see the deleted really, really amplify a lot. And a lot of this is, just bot accounts that have 15,000 followers and are following 15,000 people, just retweeting angry messages within each other to make things a bit worse. So we saw that messages about contamination, while not a lot of individuals were talking about them, there were some individuals with high subscriber accounts saying things like, hey, if you have one of these pills with a weird looking logo, throw it away. It's causing bad things in town. Deleted profiles, again, I didn't have a chance to really delve into it on this one, but I am investigating. There seems to be a pretty large bot presence there. News messages carried just the greatest volume of exposure. And, again, law enforcement is barely on that figure. But where that gets interesting is when you look at the viralities, we see that law enforcement actually did really, really well. But really more when they're coming from a position of compassion. If law enforcement was saying, don't do drugs, it's going to make you sick, or public intervention, like, hey, we're having a pill take back, drop them off, go take you fishing, which was actually a really popular program that did well. When law enforcement talked about legal consequences, don't do drugs, you're going to prison, it did nowhere near as well as when they came from a position of compassion. On the other hand, agencies, the American Heart Association tells you that something is bad for you, people are going to listen. So health consequences did really well with agencies. And social pages and individuals really didn't amplify well at all, except social pages did quite well, better than anyone else for messages about contamination, which is something I was really concerned with. So, we see it just kind of lines up to how you would expect people to listen to these messages. Next question was, when is the best time of day and week to post these? So we just kind of see, I'll be quick here, but essentially people tend to post a lot around lunchtime and a lot around when they're falling asleep. And if you can get in a little bit ahead of those times, then when everyone logs in, you're gonna be at the top of their timeline. If you're a little behind those times, then you just kind of get washed out in the algorithm. So again, we see just looking around lunchtime is like the most viral time of day to post any message, and law enforcement really did well with lunchtime tweets. So looking at exposures by day of week, this was also a bit less pronounced. Again, news does really well. And basically, Monday was a really good time for putting out a message, and Friday and Saturday messages carried the best. So another question is, how long do messages persist? So let's say that there's a batch of bad drugs coming through town and you want to tell people about it so they can make steps to protect themselves. How often do you have to tell people about it? So looking at this, we see that we're using retweets because we can't really track views, but we assume that retweets are a good proxy for views, how long things are retweeted after the original post. And we see that after about 2 hours, most of the retweets just vanish and drop off. So the lesson here is if you're looking at a bad batch of drugs coming through town, as a public agency, you need to have repeated dispatches about it, or people just might not see it in their timeline. Question number 4 was, how long do these messages carry? And here we just want to see if there's any difference. Like, does anyone reach any further on the internet? And probably is no surprise to anyone. Not really. There's not a huge pattern here. I'm pretty sure if you just mapped out population density as a function of distance, you would get the same figure. So we see a little bit of a bimodal kind of spike on the far right tail there, which if you look at that distance there, that's just coastal cities hitting coastal cities. So, again, tweets aren't really bound by location. It doesn't mean that local people won't trust local sources, but once they get out there, they just spread. And we found quite a lot of these went outside the United States, so it was interesting. Finally, we want to see, do certain keywords get retweeted more? Are there things you should mention or hit on that are going to do a lot better? And to do this, we looked at every tweet by each category, and we looked at the mean virality of tweets which contained a given keyword, and then kind of pulled out the ones that went the highest. So for public intervention, you see a lot of concerns about overreach or compassion or damages that either opioids or opioid-related interventions might be holding. For health consequences, coroner and incurable are right up there. It's pretty permanent and dire. When we look at user keywords, we see a little bit different. Law enforcement really enjoys talking about their opinions, but glad they're a trusted source and that people engage with them on that. So another question was, how does the tone of a message enhance virality? Do you always want to be peppy and upbeat, or are there times you just need to be dire and serious business? Now, what we saw was overall, there was a slight benefit to being positive. 16 categories showed some benefit from being positive, whereas 13 benefit from being negative. Contamination was the one that worked the best. If people are saying hey guys, I care about y'all, not trying to judge your life, but please, if you have one of these pills, throw it away today, it worked really well. If you come from an angry or stern or otherwise non-positive position to convey that message, people aren't engaging with it. And again, I mentioned that law enforcement did really well and they came from a position of compassion. When they spoke in a positive tone about health consequences, it really, really resonated with people. Another question was, do these messages work differently based on the context in which they're tweeted? And to do this, we just looked at a shapefile of all urban areas in the United States, geocoded these user profiles, and saw what was their location where they were posting, were they from an urban source? And what we see is here a much, much stronger advantage to having an urban source of your message than we saw from a positive message. I would guess a lot of this is just due to major news agencies or health agencies or just larger organizations existing in urban spaces. But what's interesting is while the news agencies really strongly benefit, looking at this contamination right here, social pages for contamination were far less effective than they have an urban source. And what this suggests to me is if you're talking about that bad batch of pills, if you're in the country, then coming from more trusted local sources might work a lot better. In the city, people might appreciate a more centralized news source, but it's interesting. So, just to go over a quick summary, these retweets fade pretty quickly, and they're weakly bound to their area. Twitter is a pretty good proxy for how other communications might function, but if you're trying to put health positive messages out, you need to do it often, and the more trusted of a local source, the more you might be able to get people to engage with it. I feel that law enforcement was an underutilized resource, because while they didn't get a lot of exposures, they did really, really well in both this and a prior pilot study. People just trust them when they come from the right perspective and tone. Individuals, 1,000 people talking about their drug use was far less interesting than a couple agencies talking about avoiding drugs. So also, there wasn't really any heterogeneity in how messages persisted or traveled based on where they're coming from or what they were. Everything that was putting out there was really just beholden to the algorithm. And if you don't put it out within another 2 hours, that message is just vanished beneath the tide. Finally, I feel that using this research, you could try to strategize optimal combinations of, for a given message you wish to deliver, what would be the most effective source to deliver it, what tone you should come across, based on whether you're just looking from a urban or not urban region. If you have a contaminated batch of drugs circling through town, a neutrally toned news source might do really well, as news did not seem to benefit from having strongly negative or positive article or tone. On the other hand, if you're looking from the country, like local social media influencers would carry a lot better. So a positive, like, hey guys, just looking out for you, please be careful, would do a lot better than a large city news source would. So there's some limitations. These tweets were much more difficult to score than, say, norovirus tweets, which was the first ChatterGrabber project. When someone discusses their symptoms of GI illness, it's usually pretty clear and easy to interpret. Whereas dealing with an intentionally invasive audience, you can only score 500 tweets or about 250 profiles per hour. If you're dealing with a crisis, you could pool this or try to automate with classifiers, but it's not something that can be done quickly and easily. The efficacy of classification is going to change with time, because you find as you're doing it that you learn a lot of the terms. So, in this case, I've randomly sampled across time, so at least I wouldn't be misclassifying a bunch of early messages because of things I didn't know yet. But you have to be very careful to compensate for drift you might have in your manual classification. Tweet volume is low, messages travel far, and this is really a challenging thing. You wouldn't want to be doing this for a crisis that's happening in your backyard right now. This is something you would do for a problem you think you might deal with in the future when you have the time to sit down and do it properly. Finally, tweets, they're a good proxy, they're a convenient measurement, but they're never going to perfectly represent or change minds of the public. It's hard to change minds, but this provides at least a good idea of how conversation is working on this issue. It's really important when collecting this type of data to understand how you're disseminating it, what your mission is, how you're storing it. Our ethical model for Twitter surveillance is what we call the red shirts in the mall model, where if I want to study people in red shirts, if I stood right here at the clipboard watching what stores they go into, we're used to that type of surveillance. Most people wouldn't find it creepy. If I follow someone store to store in a red shirt, watching everywhere they go, eventually they're going to have a problem with me. So we measure these events when they happen, if they happen publicly. We don't track the users or see what else they do. If they're not talking about our conditions, they're invisible to us, and their history is not something that we want to know about. So this provides a pretty viable method of assessing these strategies for message creation and distribution, but there's a trade-off. It takes a lot of effort to manually classify these tweets. You could do it automatically, but you're have to figure out what is the best amount of effort you can pool to solve the problem you're trying to solve. So for future work, I'm really interested in just seeing like what the role of bot traffic in this may have been. I found a lot of the original posters did not appear to be bots. A lot of the retweeters were, and it's just simply you can download the natural language toolkit, score a tweet, and say, is this a positive or negative message? It's very trivial to have a bot that will simply say, is this, a fire or gasoline on it? But there's something interesting there. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. I owe a lot of gratitude to my friends and family from the lab. You might not recognize Magna there in the Tyvek, but been really, really good friend through these years with the program. And yeah, does anyone have any questions?
So ChatterGrabber, do you need to know Python programming language to be able to use it? Or like if I decide tomorrow to do a different research project using that tool, what skill set would you have to be able to do?
Okay, so it's definitely handy being a Python programmer. To be honest, I learned Python while making it. So if you're a computer scientist working at ChatterGrabber, you're just going to get a pretty bad headache and be like, oh my God, why did he do that? But I've worked on it for years with a lot of different health agencies. So every feature that anyone requested got put in and everyone got it. So it's really well targeted to what health agencies have been looking for. I have virtual machines available, which, it's just, are you familiar with virtual machines?
Is that like go to my PC or no?
I'm not sure.
I don't know enough to answer that.
Okay, so it's effectively, it's like an emulator where you play old Nintendo games on a computer. This was a bit grumpy to set up. I just set up a Ubuntu virtual machine with everything configured, and you can run it on your operating system of choice. The code is all publicly available on GitHub. It's open source. It's free to use. But some of the configuration is a little tricky. I do have an online workshop available, which has the 0 to hero instructions on how to get one started. And I can share that if you'd like.
I wonder, can you Twitter from what they call a tracker phone, which is what a lot of people are using on the street?
I'm not sure. If it doesn't have Android,
I think you can. I don't know if you still can, but back in the day, before smartphones, there was a way to connect your phone number to Twitter. So I could still get notifications even before having like a smartphone. Like I would get it as a text message, like someone tweeted at me, and I could like update my tweets as well, just sending like a tweet to like the Twitter phone number, which was like automated or whatever it would send.
I'm just thinking in terms of people living on the street, like my daughter do, they have tracker phones.
Right.
So how are they getting the information? So it would only be rare moments that you would even have access to be able to send a text message.
Yeah.
So maybe some of that information isn't, I don't know if they're tweeting, I never.
So, James, I'm Nancy Hands. We've went back and forth. We haven't, but so of course I'm looking on this on many different angles, and especially messages to parents on the prevention side. But the other thing is we know our law enforcement. There's also because people that are also using Facebook Messenger.
Mm-hmm.
Has this been applied to other ways that people communicate? Because it's going to be age specific, because there aren't. Like I have three, a 23, a 28, and a 30-year-old. The 30-year-old doesn't believe in Twitter. My 28-year-old son does, because he follows all of his, anybody that's in sports. And then my 23-year-old, I think she did it when it came out and she was still in high school, and now she's all Instagram. So have you applied this to other ways that people communicate?
So Twitter and Facebook have radically different message structures. In this case, as I mentioned previously, like ChatterGrabber is an alarm system.
Okay.
I don't want to tell you that there's 20 cases. I would like to tell you that things that sound like cases are twice as common as they were yesterday, which kind of triggers that. So, the goal has never been to find everything.
Right.
I have looked into other social media platforms. For example, I do a bit of volunteer search and rescue, and during the Noah Thomas abduction case a couple years ago, I was trying to have a Facebook scraper which would look for uncommon engrams over time, as I mentioned with the little peep example, just to see if maybe a certain point in time, red van keeps popping up in the timeline. But ChatterGrabber couldn't just simply be
Right.
pointed at another social media
Right.
service.
Or even messaging, because, we're also trying to, on one side, there's, this prevention of even younger set of kids. I mean, we know that, parents are giving even 6-year-olds cell phones and iPhones, and just even the messaging to parents and then kids before they get to where, and we're trying to attack this by all different age levels and fronts. So
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And there are some tools out there which can guess a Twitter user's age, and I hadn't thought to use that. Just kind of approximate, like, child, not a child type thing.
Yeah.
But it would be really interesting to try a split instead of just having the urban to rural positive and negative, youthful, not a youth.
right.
Thank you.
Are the bots like kamikaze pilots? Like, why do they delete? If the whole idea is like we're going to amplify something, why do they delete?
I think they get filtered. So I think they get found because we see, like, you might find a rock star or an Instagram model that would have 8,000 followers and be following 1,000 people. Because if you're really popular, you don't have time to follow everyone. They can come to you. But I'd found these accounts that had weirdly symmetric 10 to 15,000 followers and 10 to 15,000 following, and they were universally very angry messages, and they had almost no original content. I really think someone is just having a sentiment scraper, pointing at a different topic and saying, people are angry about something, let's amplify that message, widen the division. There's actually, recently they found evidence of likely overseas interference in the anti-vax debate. It's like, hey, looks like America's having a bad idea. Well, let's encourage it.
We've done enough of those. I'm sorry, I did not say that.
Which was actually kind of a challenging consideration I had here. It's like, do I really want to ignore the bots? I thought about pre-filtering everything, like if this came from a bot, throw it away, but they are a part of a discourse. They're affecting how we think, how we act, and what policy decisions get made as a result of our collective thoughts. Okay. Anything else? Thank you so much for your time, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here.